have always, as an adult, since I think about 22, delivered yachts part-time down the coast of Florida to the Caribbean, up to Maine, and I still do that today. I have two primary boats that I move back and forth, one to Florida and another one to the Caribbean, and occasionally another one thrown into the mix here and there.
So you've done this before?
I've done this before, and I keep doing it, and it's what helps keep my sanity, quite frankly, getting out on the water and getting away.
Okay, great. Well, you've got an incredibly long sailing resume, but why don't we spend a minute on how you got started? How did you get into sailing?
When I was a kid, we lived over on Wampausick Point, the other side of Stonington Harbor, and it was in my great-grandmother Johnstone's house. My father was in the Navy at the time, which is why we were here in Stonington. My mother's side, the Johnstones, were from Stonington. And there was an aluminum skiff pram on the beach, and one day when I was 5, my mother pulled it out of the weeds, stuck a mast and a sail and the rudder and the centerboard in it, and plopped me in the boat and pushed me off from the shores of Stonington Harbor, or the other side of Wampausick Point. And from there, she'd just sit on the dock and bark out a few instructions: pull this, push that, and eventually she'd just go sit in her lawn chair and let me do my thing out there. And so that was my first real sailing experience. And then that same summer, I started to crew with my uncle Rod Johnstone, who's the designer of J-boats. Wasn't back then, obviously, that was years and years before he did that, but we were racing Falcons in Stonington Harbor. So I'd crew for him. When we came around the weather mark, he'd put me on the helm and tell me where to steer, and I'd hang on for dear life, and he'd go forward and set the spinnaker. And we get to the leeward mark, he'd pull the chute down and come back and steer the boat upwind. So I did that with Rodney for years, and then I started crewing for another famous local sailor named Bill Boatwright. The Boatwrights were a big local family, and Bill was an excellent sailor, so I started crewing back and forth between Rodney and Bill, and then started to get into different boats, more performance-oriented boats, 420s and 470s. And then as I got to be a teenager, I took lessons. We were members of the Wattawanna Club. I took sailing lessons there. And as I became a teenager, I started to sail some of these boats with friends and cousins and so forth in various races. So that's sort of the summary of my younger years.
You've got a long resume here of things you've done, but let's try to zero in on one, and that's the transatlantic, the mini transatlantic.
Yeah.
You could talk a little bit about why you picked that. It sounds like it was quite a challenge, and a little bit about the race itself.
Yeah, I've been doing offshore sailing since I was 21. I left when I graduated from the University of Connecticut. A friend of mine who lives in town, Thomas Mitchell, with the help of his father, Jack Mitchell, got a J30, and 3 of us took off from Stonington, sailed down the coast of the U.S. and through the Caribbean and back over 6 months. And that's what really sort of sparked my imagination and got me excited about sailing at sea. I'd never done it before. But prior to that, it was out and back the same day in a race, or for a pleasure sail, or maybe one night in an overnight race. So that's what really sort of got that side going in me, the adventure, the challenge of figuring out how to navigate from one place to another, the weather, being self-sufficient, being able to fix things at sea. So based on that, I did for years and years and years, I did yacht deliveries, ocean sailing. not really ocean racing, but ocean sailing. Here to Florida, the Caribbean, Maine, and then I captained a 70-footer that was based here in Stonington, a boat called by the name of Kim, that was owned by a gentleman by the name of John Dearden. And I captained that boat for 5 years, back and forth between here and the Caribbean. And I got to know some French sailors who were doing, one person in particular, this girl Isabel, who was doing this race, this transatlantic race. And so I got somewhat interested in it, and I didn't really realize it even existed up to that point. My experience with sort of the solo racing with these big boats that were wildly expensive. And so she ended up doing the race, and prior to the first mini transat that she did, which was in 2005, I did some research, and I went and asked Rodney Johnstone, my uncle, I said, can you design me one of these boats? And he said, sure, what the hell is it? And so we went round and round. This, by then, that was, I think it was about 2005 then. And we spent 6 months going back and forth on the design, the shapes. The French boats, the European boats, they're only 21 feet long, but they look like flying discs. They're 10 feet, the rule says it can be 10 feet wide, maximum beam. And a lot of these boats are not only 10 feet wide in the middle, they're 10 feet wide in the stern. So they go for all these form stability shapes. These boats have canting keels, water ballast tanks, carbon fiber masts, very complicated boats. And so I said to myself, well, I think I can possibly get into this race, and what would make it unique is, I could have gone over and purchased a boat in Europe, used boats, and a lot of the used boats were competitive. But I thought, okay, it would be unique if I get Rodney to design the boat, and we build it locally here, and I show up over and qualify to race this thing. And that's basically how it went. With Rodney, we finally settled on a design. I used a little shop up in Maine that literally just made the hull and the deck and glued them together. I went and helped them out for, I think, 5 weeks straight up in Maine. And then I trucked the boat, this carbon fiber evil looking shell, down here to Dotson's and put it in a shed, and spent, I think it was the next 12 months working on the boat, night and day. And it was putting all the structure inside and building the rudders and the dagger boards and making the cannon keel work. And the whole community pretty much got involved in the project. People would stop by and help me out, ask questions. And so it became pretty much a local endeavor. It wasn't just me going and doing the mini transat race. It was tons of local people that really got involved in the project. So it made it unique in that sense. It was different than showing up in France and buying a used, well-established boat, which in the end, it would have been a lot cheaper. Of course, all these things, like any boat project that you ever do, you can think about what it's going to cost and get advice and expert advice, and then come up with a number, and what you should do is go to bed and wake up the next morning and multiply it times 3. And sure enough, I think I thought it was going to cost $70,000 or $80,000 to build this boat. Rodney, my uncle, wasn't going to charge me a design fee. I was going to do all this work myself. And that was true. All these things were true. But by the time it was said and done, it was still a $210,000 boat. Just wildly expensive. Super high tech, all carbon, but you get to the point, partway through the project, there were many times I'd lay in bed at night and I'd go, what have you gotten yourself into? This is incredible. This is crazy. And you'd run out of money, or I had plenty of local people that helped on a sponsorship level, sort of. Now, there were some bigger ones that got the name on the boat, but none of it to cover huge amounts. It was $100 here and $500 there and $1,000 here, and a lot of people helped with that. But there were also plenty of times where I ran out. And I'd say, all right, I have a Visa card, a MasterCard, and another Visa card, and another MasterCard. Are you going to just stop here? Or are you going to? So I would run those up and buy epoxy and carbon fiber and this and that. And next thing you know, we had a boat sitting in a shed here at Dotson's.
At $10,000 a foot.
It was incredible. Yeah, I mean, I still shake my head when it's all. But it wouldn't have had the same. It wouldn't have been the same story if I had shown up in France and bought a Finot, a French designer, and gone racing. Yeah, people would have been excited and interested. But here was the boat. I could drag it up to Stonington Harbor, which I did, I think, 3 times over a few years, and gave talks, and people could go see it. And I'd sail it out here. Well, the first time I ever sailed was here, and the launching was, there must have been 300 people at the launching of the boat it was March at Dotson's. And Rodney and I went and took it out for a sail. It wasn't this bad, but it wasn't a great day. And that was the beginning of the whole thing. And I would still go home and lay in bed and go, now it took a year to build the boat, and the Transat was 2 years away. I had to spend, by the year that I did the race, in 2007, it was the 30th anniversary of the race. And it's run every other year, so the 15th running of the race. But because of this, there were all these people that wanted to get in it, all these French sailors that had done it before 2 or 3 times, these big names and a few Brits. And up until that point, they only allowed, I think it was 72 boats on the starting line. Because they came up with this number over time that any more than that is just too dangerous to manage these many boats out on the ocean, these little things. And they had, maybe in 2006, when I got the boat built, a year before the race, they had people expressing interest, 120 or so different boats expressing interest, sailors. And so the way you got into one of these 72 slots was through qualifying miles. You couldn't do the race unless you did a 1,000-mile solo sail, non-race event. You had to do that at the minimum. And then you had to have 1,000 miles in races. And in France, they have all these shorter races. A 200-mile solo race, a 700-mile double-handed race that goes up around Fastnet and back to France. And a race to the Azores and back for a total of, I think that was 2,000 total down and back. And it didn't matter whether it was solo or double-handed. I think you had to have maybe a certain amount in solo. But these all counted. And the sooner you got your miles done and your solo sail done, you were on the list. And if you didn't do it till the year of the mini Transat, you might be 100th on the list. So then you're hoping people decide, they back out or they do this or that. So I said, after all this work I did on the boat, I'm going to Europe, racing this boat, getting on the list. I'm not going to put it to chance that I don't get in this race. And so we built the boat, sailed it here one day in March in Stonington. I loaded it on this trailer that I had, and I towed it down to Cape Hatteras, Beaufort, North Carolina. And they had these 2 set courses in Europe you could do for your 1,000-mile solo sail. And you had to sail around and take photos of Lamb Lighthouse and photos of your GPS and logbook and send it on, show them that you did it. And I got approval from the organizers in France to do this 1,000-mile solo sail over here that went from basically Beaufort, Cape Hatteras, right below Cape Hatteras, down around the northern Bahamas, and finish in Charleston. It was like 1,100 miles. I gave them this whole proposal and they signed off on it. So I trucked the boat down there after sailing it with Rodney for maybe 2 hours here in Stonington. Launched it in Morehead City, took it over to Beaufort, which is right next door. Beautiful little waterfront town, kind of like a southern version of Stonington. Parked it on dock. It's March, and I put the boat together with his friend from Stonington, Ron Lewis. He was kind of my sort of preparator, as the French say, and I had hired this this woman I used for Gulfstream stuff, and her husband for weather forecasting. And it's March. The weather isn't great in March down around the Cape Hatteras area. So there were big fronts coming off, northeast winds pushing against the Gulfstream going up, Gulfstream going north, so big season. I'm sitting there waiting in Beaufort with my friend Ron, boats rigged at the dock. No, don't go, it's dangerous out there, don't go, these guys are... Finally, and I was like, I think I can get out of here. If I listen to these guys, I'll never leave. And so I took off out of Beaufort, and it was somewhat nice. It was sunny out, but there was still a northeast wind running, and it was dark, and I got in the Gulfstream that night by mistake. The Gulfstream's not that far offshore there. And I got out and I got in the Gulfstream, and I'm banging around on this 21-foot boat that's been tested for 2 hours, and I had the main prevented out, so I couldn't do something, go through a jibe and have the boom slam across the boat and pull the rig down. Or I'm going along and I see these lights coming. I'm like, oh no, it's a freighter up ahead. And I'm in the Gulfstream. And I go to tack the boat, and I forgot to take the preventer off, and the boat is going sideways. And by the time I got it straightened out and got out of the Gulfstream, I went and laid down below, and I said, oh no, what have you done? You've spent $210,000 and a year of your life on this boat. What did you do that for? And I laid down below on that boat for that night. I took the jib down. I just had the main up. I was going along at 4 knots, just slowly, kind of broad reaching, going, I can't believe you did this. And mind you, this is 11 years ago. I'm 47. I'm not a 25-year-old kid, which a lot of people in the race are, 25, 30. And that was my first solo sail ever. Oh, maybe I've moved a boat from here somewhere overnight by myself, but that was basically my first solo sail on this boat that we built, which a lot of stuff we shot from the hip on, the canning keel and the mechanics of that, and finally the sun came up and mellowed out. I tacked the boat, I put the jib up, started reaching down towards Frying Pan Shoal, and then I finally said, well, I might as well poke across the Gulfstream now and get in the warm weather, and I did that, and every day was better and better and better. And the rest of the sail, there were a few things I had to fix at sea. The rudders, gudgeons started to want to fall off the boat, and you start learning pretty quickly that you don't get bored out there.
So you got your slot in the race?
Yeah, I showed up in Europe. That was in March. It's incredible how many people stepped up to the plate. Some I didn't even know. There was a shipping company from Holland called 7-Star Yacht Transport. And somehow the owner was interested in, one of the owners, Richard Clavers, this Dutchman, was interested in this class. And I don't even remember how the two of us were put in touch with each other. But he contacted me And I talked to him, you know, back and forth with him. He said, yeah, I'll ship your boat over to Europe for free. He said, you just need to get it to Jacksonville. And it wasn't long after the solo sail. I brought it up back to Stonington, I think, for maybe 2 weeks of, you know, little tweaks. And I turned around and towed it down to Florida and put it on a car carrier that went to Belgium. And then I picked it up in Belgium and drove it down to the coast of France. And it was one of these things where you're driving along. I had bought this British Ford Transit van long before they had those things here. It had 4 cylinders that barely pulled the thing. I'd be going up these bridges in France going 10 miles an hour and pulling through these toll booths that it's like here, the boat was illegal, it was over with. And I pulled through these toll booths and they had one at the very end with another one not on the other side, for especially for wide loads. I pull into there and I get out, go to the next booth, and they'd usually open it up. They'd say, no, get over here if the boat is legal. So I'd be driving it through these French toll booths, looking through at the mirrors, clearing the sides by this much, going, again, thinking to myself, what have you done? Fortunately, I had, you know, this friend Isabel there, and I got to know other people, and I towed it down, and I did the first race in a place called Douarnenez in Brittany. It took me 3-4 days to put the boat together. I got it in the water. There were 82 boats in this race. I think it was a 250-mile race, so a day and a half, 2 days or something. We got out to the start, all these boats going around. They don't allow, in this class, they don't allow chart plotters. You're not allowed to take a cell phone on the boat. You got to turn them in. So you're out there, and when you have a GPS that, you know, numbers on it, and it'll give you a speed over the ground and course over the ground, but you got to plot it on a chart. And I went out for this race off of Douarnenez, and it's pea soup fog. And they started us, and you're tacking up along the shore, and you get out to the end of the point, and you go through this area that is more treacherous than going through the race. There's lighthouses, islands, and the current goes at 5 knots. And we're tacking through there, 80 some odd boats, tacking back and forth in the fog, and you're running down below. You put it on autopilot, try and plot where you are. You're putting the chart on your wet pants because, you know, sort of this heavy dew. And I'm going, oh man, and some boats are coming through with spinnakers up. I'm thinking, there's no way I'll do that. I don't know where I am. I can't come through with a spinnaker up. So you do that. I spent a day and a half in that race. I barely saw anybody. I saw a few boats at a leeward mark 100 miles away. We all converged and went around, and we got going upwind, and I said to myself, you're doing not very well here, but who cares? You're getting the qualifying miles. I didn't really give it, I said, all right. And we're going back towards the finish, tacking back and forth. I didn't see anybody. I saw one boat the whole last 100 miles to the finish. And I said, boy, you really blew it on your tactics, but there you go, you get qualifying miles. And as I rounded one point towards the finish, and I didn't even hoist my spinnaker, I was tired. I said, I don't care, I'll just be safe. One boat passed me. I got into the finish, and they always, because we don't have motors on these boats, they come out in these rubber Avons and Zodiacs, and they pull up alongside you and tie up and take you into the harbor. And as I crossed the finish line, one of these Avons came driving up, and they're like, fifth place. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. I thought it was 30th, 35th, 40th, or. So that was the first race, and then there were that was the first solo race, and after that was a double-handed fastnet race, which was 700 miles, and then another little local 200-mile race, and then I did a race to the Azores and back, which was a 2-part race. You race, stop for a week, race back. To get qualifying miles, you had to do both legs of the race. If you just went to the Azores and decided not to race back to France, you didn't get any. Well, halfway to the Azores, this is still 2006, a year before the mini transit, I broke my mast. So I'm 700 miles out from the Azores with a broken mast. I had a stump, the mast on the boat was 40 feet high, and I had 15 feet or so of the mast left. So I rigged up storm sails sideways. Fortunately, it was downwind to the Azores. So I got there in the time allotment. They closed the starting line, at a certain time. I got there a couple hours before the starting line before the finish line closed. So I was the next to the last boat to finish. There was one other broken down boat behind me. I actually got the qualifying miles for the leg down. And my brother-in-law, who's my partner at the restaurant, David Eck, at the time was working for a mast building company here in Ledyard called Forte. They weren't the guys that built the mast that I broke. He knew I had broken my mast when I was out there because I had they had this tracking beacon on the boat, and it had 3 buttons, and one was you could push it and say I'm all right, because if they were looking at you on the satellite tracker and they saw you weren't moving, maybe you were fixing something, they would eventually get concerned that maybe you fell over the side. So you push that and say, I know you're worried about me, but I'm all right. And number 2, if you push that, was you're telling them you got a broken mast, but you're all right. And number 3 was you need help, but it's not an emergency. It's not an EPIRB situation or something. So I pushed number 2. So then the guys at the race headquarters who were doing updates, and you could see it on the computer, and Clay Burkhalter on Acadia has broken his mast. And a day and a half later, this bigger boat, they have bigger boats out on the course that are fully crewed, 45, 50 footer, 60 footer, for safety, the safety boats. And so there might be 5 or 6, I think on the transatlantic race, or maybe 10. And so one of these guys came by a day and a half later or something like that, asked if I was okay, took photos. I said, yeah, I'm all right. So they took off. And so David knew I'd broken my mast, and he hopped on a plane and went over before I even got there, thinking that maybe I had saved all the pieces and we could splice it back together and I could do the leg home and get the qualifying miles. And he didn't realize that I had ejected the part that I broke. So he showed up in the Azores, I think 8 hours after I got there. So David showed up, and actually, as a sort of side story, that is here, David being in Horta, in the Azores, the town of Horta, which is a big, huge sailing town. Horta is this place where everybody who sails across the Atlantic pulls in, and they paint their names on the breakwater and the stones, the bulkheads lining the marina. They paint the boat, pictures of the boat. I mean, it's this beautiful place. And there's this famous sailors bar in Horta called Peter's Cafe. It's been around forever. And you go in, and it's got everything on the ceiling and on the walls, burgees and hats. And it was a beautiful day in August, and we were sitting outside having a beer. And I said to Dave, as we were trying to figure out how I was going to get home and do the qualifier, go back and do the qualifying part, I said, maybe when the transatlantic race is over in a year and a half, we should start our own sailors bar. So that's how the idea started of having our own place, was there.
A lot of good ideas to start in bars.
And if I hadn't broken the mast and done that, and he had shown up there, we probably would have never come up with that idea. But
so how did you get back?
We met this great guy, American guy, who owned this place called Mid-Atlantic Yacht Services in the Azores. I actually stayed at his house for a week. And he helped us. We looked around. We tried to find even a J-24 mast on the island it didn't matter what it was, that we could get and put in the boat. And I didn't care, how quickly I got home or back to France. It was back to Les Sables d'Olonne, Atlantic coast of France. It didn't matter, but I couldn't find one. So in the end, I didn't do the second part of the race. And so I was giving out various parts and pieces to my safety gear to people that had broken things and this and that, and the race committee was thrilled with that. And I'm like, how the hell do I get the boat out of here? And I wanted to have it back. I hadn't decided yet whether to leave it in Europe and work on it over there for the winter. It was coming up to the off season, or bring it back here and do some training. And there's one island there, I think it's San Miguel, where the U.S. has I think it's a Navy airfield, or Air Force has a place there. And there is one cargo ship out of Norfolk, not a huge one. It goes back and forth, I don't know, once every 2 weeks or once every 3 weeks, maybe once a month, I don't remember, and delivers supplies to this military facility that's based in the Azores. It wasn't on the island. I think that how you pronounce the island where Horta is Fayal, I think, but it wasn't there. So I had to get the boat from there to San Miguel, and then load it on this U.S. flagged ship that went to Norfolk. And that's what we did. This guy, Duncan Weaver, who had Mid-Atlantic Yacht Service, helped organize getting the thing on a cargo ship out of Horta and over to San Miguel. And my trailer, which was custom made for the boat, was still in France. And somehow we got that from the mainland of France down to San Miguel. So now the things are mated up again. Boat goes on the trailer and it goes on this ship bound for Norfolk. In the hold, they had it underneath, and David Eck and I drove to Norfolk, picked this thing up and towed it back up here to Stonington, and into the shed it went for modifications. And now the mast company he was working with in Ledyard, I went there and had my new mast built. And then that year, so that was 2006, 2007, that winter, that late fall winter. So I built the mast, went up to Stonington Harbor Yacht Club, did another talk about my sailing so far, and I had not gotten all of the qualifying miles, which means I had to go back next summer to finish it off. I think I had 600 miles. So I had to go back next summer and finish it off, which meant I would have been deep on the waiting list. And they had this one thing that they used for certain foreign sailors to try and encourage more non-European competition. People outside of France and England and Spain and Italy. And it was, I don't remember the terminology they used for it, but they could allow 5 slots for these, it would be for Australians, Americans, New Zealanders, maybe South Africans. You could apply for it if you're from one of these places. And it was totally discretionary of the race organizers. And that, prior to that, they had indicated that they weren't going to grant any of these because the demand to get in the race was so high that they just didn't want to do that, these special spots for these foreigners. However, I applied for it, and they turned around and gave me one. So I had this guaranteed spot to be on the starting line in the race. I still had to get 300 or 400 more miles of qualifying miles, 1,000 total. But it didn't matter. When I went over in 2007 and started racing again, I could get it, and I was on the list. I wasn't down on the waiting list. So they gave me that. So I knew I was all set. We rigged up, did further work on the boat. I went to Florida right after Christmas, right after New Year's in 2007, and spent 2 months, 2.5 months, maybe 3 months training in Florida between Key West and Miami, practicing on the boat every day. And then again, these guys from Seven Star put it on a ship. This time it was out of Fort Lauderdale, I think, and off it went back to Europe. And I showed up in April, I think, and did the first qualifying race in April. I did a lot of racing in 2007 prior to the mini transat race in September. I think I did 5 or 6 different races. None as big as the year before was the big race, the Azores race. The year of the mini transat, the big race was the mini transat, 4,200 miles. So there were some 400 or 500 mile races. So I did a series of those races all summer just for more practice. And one of the races I actually was a double-handed race, and Rodney showed up to do it with me. It was a 240-mile race, maybe, 83 boats. And the French know the J-boats well. Actually, they have a boat. J-boats has a builder in France. Rodney was 70 at the time that he showed up. We were the 2 old men in the sea on this boat. There aren't a lot of people above 35 that are racing this boat, and here I am. By then I was 49. Rodney's 70, and all the competitors were thrilled to meet him. They all were, I think, polite, thinking that we were gonna, just get around the race course, and we ended up getting 3rd out of 83 boats. So they were all very, very impressed at the award ceremony. They made special mention of Rodney, and so it was fun.
Well, good. So then the race comes, and I have a couple of questions. It sounds like some of these boats might have some pretty big syndicate sponsorships behind them.
Yeah, the French especially, some of the Brits, but primarily the French, for the top few. If there were, out of the 89 boats in the race, between the prototype and the series or the production division, it was probably 55, 60 French sailors. The rest were Brits, a couple Spaniards, and 1 or 2 maybe Italians, a couple Slovenians, 1 or 2 Poles, a Kiwi, an Aussie, 2 Americans, a few Brits, if I didn't mention those guys. And so there's a mishmash, but the French are the big ones as far as the numbers go. And in France, sailing is one of the big sports. If you were to pick the 5 biggest sports as far as being followed by the general public over there, it's probably sailing, tennis, soccer, or as they call it, football, and maybe rugby, and those are the big ones. And everybody knows who the people are. Everybody knows who the top sailors are. It's covered in the papers every day. When you have the starts of these races, when we had the start of the Azores race in La Sable d'Olonne, which is where they start the around the world Vendée Globe, the big solo race, there were thousands of people that you have to be in these race villages, as they call it. For that race, I think it was a week in advance. All the boats are there. They're all decorated with flags. The sailors are on their boats. And the public just comes and walks the docks and talks to the sailors, and they have a sort of a village with stuff set up and displays and TVs and footage, and then when you go out the day of the race, there are these big breakwaters, and everybody's lining the breakwaters and cheering people on as they're going out. And so in France, it's a really big, it's a big deal. So their sponsorship from banks, insurance companies, food companies, it's all part of the scene. And the mini transat is, for a lot of these French sailors, is the first step in this whole solo sailing thing. And you go from the mini transat to a boat called the Figaro, which is extremely competitive. It's a 32-foot Beneteau, but custom set up for shorthanded sailing. And then now, that wasn't really there when I was there, but now the Class 40 is the next step. And then the Vendée Globe, these 60-foot solo around the world boats. And the mini transat, or the mini boats, which are really, it's called the 6.5 meter class. A lot of the innovations for the bigger boats, especially the Vendée Globe boats, or as they call it, the IMOCA 60s, is the technical name of the class. A lot of the innovations that end up in that class came from the minis, or the 6.5 meter class. The water ballast tanks, the canning keels, and eventually get incorporated into the bigger boats. So you'll have not plenty, out of the 60 or 55 French sailors, you might have had 15 that were fully sponsored. They didn't have to do anything else. That was their job, racing. They had a car that was, or a van provided by the company with all their logos, and the boat had all the logos, and everything's paid for. They get a salary, not a lot, but small. And then the next step would be sailors that also have another job, but they're getting some sponsorship, some money, some in-kind service, suit of sails, or this type of thing. And then you would have some, and it's easier to do it over there. They just did it. Like, you're a sailor here and you go sail. It's easier to do there because you say, all right, I'm going to take a month off of work and do the mini transat, and they're doing various weekend races before. And the Brits are the same. You'd have a couple of big Brits that might have sponsorship. Ellen MacArthur started in the mini transat class. Sam Davies, who's a big female French British sailor, the same. Coming from anywhere outside of Europe, which is one reason they have these 5 spots to try and get more people over there. It's a full-time thing. You're not going over and racing for a week and coming back and working, and it's a full-time deal. So it's not easy doing it from here.
So what was the camaraderie of the sailors? Was it competitive? Was it, you're part of the club? Were there cliques among the sailors that had different levels of support? What was the interaction like with the other sailors?
Now, I would say with a mini transat, in my experience with any solo sailing, solo racing, I've since done the Bermuda 1-2 twice. It is plenty, camaraderie first, really, and then competitiveness second. Everybody's very competitive. They want to win. They want to do this, but everybody will stop and drop everything they're doing to help somebody else out, especially at sea. And a lot of times you would have a group of, and it wouldn't be because it was a clique or something, it might be 10 of us in one area, and we would hire a trainer. And they have the thing in France is you really, as I was saying before, it's such a big sport, enthusiastic sport. A lot of the marinas up and down the coast in the Atlantic and the Med are town or government marinas. Almost every town has a sailing school there. And I was told by one French sailor that after World War II, when they were trying to find things for kids to do after school to keep them busy, one of them was setting up these sailing schools all over the country. So you have a level of professionalism there that is not as easy to find here. I think it's starting to happen a little bit, like the Oak Cliff sailing program out in Long Island is somewhat modeled after some of these French programs. But you can get these trainers who are incredible, and so there'd be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of us that would go out, and this guy would come around in a, in a whaler and follow you and say, no, trim this more, do this to your spinnaker. And there's a lot of practice on these boats because you're doing jibes on these things with these boats have massive spinnakers on them with running backstays. So you've got to be able to jibe the spinnaker, and as you're driving the spinnaker, trim one backstay and let the other backstay off. Because the mains were so big, these big square top fat head mains, you couldn't have a regular backstay. So to figure out how to do this stuff efficiently was an incredible thing. And I never was that great at it. To watch the French sailors do it, these people who trained all the time, I'd look at them, I'd be fumbling around, I'd get the spinnaker wrapped. You also had a spinnaker pole that was, it rotated around the front leg of the bow pulpit. It wasn't a fixed sprit. So not only did you have to get this asymmetrical huge spinnaker from one side of the boat to the other, you had to also rotate the pole somewhat back, because if it was dead forward, you had these struts on either side with guy lines that went through it. You could lose control of it and then it'd flop there, you just lose the angle. It was all these things, and I would see these French sailors in these races come up from behind me, and it'd be 30 knots of wind. And I'd be tired, and I go, if I keep trying to fly the spinnaker or something, I'm going to ruin this boat, or I'm going to do something horrible, and I would just take it down. And I'd see these French sailors come up from behind me, jibing back and forth. And it was like they had a full crew on the boat. And so you would have these trainers that would go out and work with you on this stuff, and it would be, you're all friends, and it was a great time, and you'd all hang out and go out to dinner and go out to bars, and so there was, I'd say camaraderie first, and then sort of the competition second.
So how many boats started?
89 boats.
And that was in La Rochelle?
That was in La Rochelle.
So the course goes La Rochelle, Madeira, Brazil.
La Rochelle, Madeira, Brazil. So about, I think the first leg was 1,200 miles, and that took me 6 days to do that. It was light air, leaving the Cape, leaving the Bay of Biscay, which was great because a lot of times it's pretty treacherous in that place. I did some previous shorter races there that were pretty brutal. There, so you go out, get around Cape Finisterre, which is kind of hairy because there's a ton of shipping traffic there, and then down the coast of Portugal, basically, into Madeira. I got there, and I didn't do very well in the first leg. I got there in 22nd place, and then you stop for, I think it was 8 or 9 days. Everybody stops. The first boat got there which was my friend Isabel. She actually got first place on that leg down. First woman to ever win a leg of the race. She got there probably about 15 hours before I did, and then the last boat I think crossed the line maybe a day later. They probably had problems. So then we all stop. Everybody's got rooms. Some people have friends and family. I had a couple different people come over and help me do some stuff on the boat. I had camaraderie there. You've got a bar that was sort of set up as the Transat bar, and they had an awards ceremony there for the first leg. And then you restart there, and everybody starts at the same time, and off to Brazil you go for 3,200 miles.
So you start at the same time, they don't stagger it based on when you came in?
No, you start at the same time, and then they have awards for the first leg, awards for the second leg, and then combined, basically your time combined for the 2 legs. And on the second leg, I came across the line at 13th place, and that was a day behind the leader, this big French sailor, Yves. And then I think the last, and that was, it took me 19 days to get to Brazil. So Yves got there in 18 days, maybe a little less than that. And the last sailor pulled in 5 days later or 6 days later.
So when I talk to other people who have done single-handed, and these are cruising stories, they talk about they have a lot of time. I'm assuming when you're racing, that's not the case.
Yeah, no. My experience when I go to sea, and it doesn't matter whether it's a yacht delivery or a race, once you get 2 or 3 days into the flow, then the days just, one sort of blends into the next. In racing, I'm very competitive when I get out there. And one thing I learned early in this class, I actually learned it in the Azores race when I broke my mast. It was the first race where there was some big winds. And so the sun go down, I was doing 13 knots with the sun up and the spinnaker up. The sun went down, I'd take the spinnaker down, I'd put the jib up and sail with the main and go down, drop down to 10 knots. And I'd say, well, and at that time I think I was in 12th place. This is in the Azores race the year before, and I go, well, if everybody else is doing the same thing, I'd wake up the next morning, and for that race and also the mini transat race, once a day there was this shortwave radio broadcast. This is the only communications we had other than a VHF radio, which was only good for 25 miles. It's only good for another competitor that was just almost within sight. Couldn't talk to anybody. You didn't have sat phones back then. They weren't as prevalent as they are now, but you weren't allowed to have them. You weren't even allowed to carry a cell phone on the boat. And so they had this broadcast once a day, Radio Monaco it was, and you'd hear this scratchy, hello, first in French, and then they do it in English. They come on at 11 GMT every day, and they would give forecasts based on zones, and you'd know in advance on this chart these zones, and they'd say for here the weather's this, and for here the weather's that, and for here. So that way it covered kind of the whole group as well as a day or two in front of the leaders. So you had that, and then they would sit there and read off the positions. And they wouldn't tell you your latitude and longitude. They would just say the name of the boat, the position it was in, and the miles from the finish. So there might, maybe I was in 12th place and 900 miles or 1,000 miles from the finish, and the 13th place boat was 1,205 miles from the finish. I didn't know if he was straight behind me or way 100 miles one way. You didn't know that, but you got this every day, and so that kept me going because you go, all right, you can see. But the Azores race, when I took the spinnaker down that first night, I was like, everybody else is doing the same. I woke up and got the broadcast the next day, and I dropped to 24th place. I was like, okay, the crazy French sailors and the rest are just pushing all the time with these big sails up. Doesn't matter what.
So how would you sleep? Just
Yeah, not
snippets?
well. There were a few sailors who've done this race, and most of them were some of the top finishers, including the guy Yves Leblevec, who won. I think it was the third time he'd done it. One of the advantages of doing a race like this before as opposed to just being a great sailor with a great boat and going out and doing the race, is one of the advantages is you understand from the past race or races all the places that you struggled. Sleeping, your sail selection, and that type of thing. And there were times that my boat was not as fast as some of the French boats. My boat was great upwind, a typical J boat. There wasn't, some of these coastal qualifying races in France, you go upwind and then come back down. Some of those we did great on, but on this big ocean race where a lot of it's reaching and running, and I didn't do so well as if I wasn't as fast. I shouldn't say do so well. And if it was light air, I'd do great because these big fat boats, there's a surface area that they just hard to get the water separation. So I would find myself pushing all the time, and some of the French sailors, the best on the leg to Madeira from La Rochelle. There were 3 or 4 boats in one day that broke the record on mini in these 6.5 meter, the minis, broke the record on a 24-hour day. One got 295, another one got 297, another one got 299, another one got 301 miles in 24 hours. My boat, if I got a 240, 250 mile day, if you were pushing like crazy, that would have been an incredible day. But these, when it was blowing out, you had the spinnaker up. You didn't have any choice if you wanted to compete with these people. They would literally sit in the cockpit. You had these lime bags, and they would